The town of Hollow's End was a place forgotten by time. Nestled deep within a dense forest, it was a cluster of crumbling cottages and overgrown paths, where the sun rarely pierced through the canopy. The townsfolk spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting nervously to the woods that surrounded them. They had a saying, "When the wind stops, the hollowing begins." No one ever explained what it meant, and outsiders who asked were met with silence or a cold stare. Clara had come to Hollow's End to escape. Her life in the city had become a suffocating mess of broken relationships and mounting debt. She thought the quiet solitude of the town would help her start over. She rented a small cottage on the edge of the forest, its roof sagging and its windows clouded with grime. The townsfolk watched her move in with wary eyes, but no one offered to help. The first few days were peaceful. Clara spent her time cleaning the cottage and exploring the woods, though she never ventured too far. The forest had an unnatural stillness, as if it were holding its breath. The birdsong was sparse, and the animals she did see moved quickly, as though fleeing something unseen. At night, the wind would howl through the trees, a mournful sound that made her pull the blankets tighter around herself. But then, one evening, the wind stopped. Clara was sitting by the fireplace, reading a book, when she noticed the silence. The constant rustling of leaves outside had ceased, and the air felt heavy, oppressive. She stood and peered out the window. The forest was unnervingly still, the trees standing like sentinels in the fading light. She felt a chill crawl up her spine and turned away, deciding to go to bed early. That night, she dreamed of the forest. In her dream, she was walking among the trees, the ground soft beneath her feet. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. She heard a sound, a low, guttural whisper, and turned to see a figure standing among the trees. It was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long, its face a featureless void. It beckoned to her, and though she tried to run, her feet were rooted to the spot. The figure began to move toward her, its movements jerky and unnatural. Just as it reached her, she woke with a start, her heart pounding. The next morning, Clara tried to shake off the dream, but it lingered in her mind like a bad taste. She decided to visit the town square, hoping to find some distraction. The townsfolk were gathered in small groups, their faces pale and drawn. They fell silent as she approached, their eyes darting away. She tried to strike up a conversation with an elderly woman selling herbs, but the woman only shook her head and muttered, "The wind has stopped. Best stay inside." Clara returned to her cottage, unease gnawing at her. As the days passed, the silence grew heavier, and the forest seemed to close in around her. She began to hear whispers at night, faint and indistinct, coming from the woods. She told herself it was her imagination, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to call her name, their voices tinged with desperation. One night, unable to resist, she followed the whispers into the forest. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisted and gnarled. The ground was soft beneath her feet, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. The whispers led her deeper and deeper, until she came to a clearing. In the center stood the figure from her dream, its featureless face turned toward her. It beckoned, and this time, she couldn't move. Her body felt heavy, as though the very air were pressing down on her. The figure approached, its movements jerky and unnatural. As it drew closer, she saw that its body was hollow, its chest and abdomen a gaping void. It reached out a long, skeletal hand, and she felt a cold, numbing sensation spread through her body. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure leaned in, its void-like face inches from hers, and she felt herself being pulled into the emptiness within it. The next morning, the wind returned, howling through the trees as though mourning a loss. The townsfolk gathered in the square, their faces grim. They knew what had happened, though they would never speak of it. Clara's cottage stood empty, its door hanging open, the wind whistling through the cracks. And deep within the forest, the hollowing waited, patient and hungry, for the next time the wind would stop. Days turned into weeks, and the townsfolk of Hollow's End returned to their routines, though the memory of Clara's disappearance lingered like a shadow. The wind continued to howl through the trees, and the forest remained as still and foreboding as ever. But the whispers did not return, and the townsfolk began to hope that the Hollowing had been sated, for now. Yet, in the darkest corners of the town, where the lamplight did not reach, the older residents exchanged knowing glances. They remembered the last time the wind had stopped, decades ago, when a young boy had vanished into the woods. They remembered the hollow look in his mother's eyes when she emerged days later, muttering about the figure in the forest. She had never been the same, and neither had the town. Clara's cottage remained untouched, a grim reminder of the danger that lurked just beyond the edge of the forest. The townsfolk avoided it, crossing the street to give it a wide berth. But one day, a stranger arrived in Hollow's End, a man named Thomas, who claimed to be Clara's cousin. He had come looking for her, he said, after she stopped answering his letters. The townsfolk tried to dissuade him, their warnings vague but urgent. The forest is no place for outsiders, they said. Best leave it be. But Thomas was determined. He had always been close to Clara, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened to her. He moved into her cottage, ignoring the uneasy glances of the townsfolk. The first night, he slept fitfully, the wind howling outside his window. But on the second night, the wind stopped. Thomas woke to an oppressive silence. The air felt heavy, and the darkness seemed to press in on him from all sides. He lit a lantern and stepped outside, his breath visible in the cold night air. The forest was unnaturally still, the trees standing like silent sentinels. He felt a chill crawl up his spine but pushed it aside, determined to find Clara. As he ventured deeper into the woods, the whispers began. At first, they were faint, barely audible over the sound of his own footsteps. But as he pressed on, they grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to come from all around him, a cacophony of voices that made his head spin. He tried to block them out, focusing on the path ahead, but they grew louder still, until they were almost deafening. And then, he saw it. The figure stood at the edge of a clearing, its tall, emaciated form silhouetted against the moonlight. Its face was a featureless void, and its chest was a gaping hollow. It beckoned to him, and though every instinct screamed at him to run, he found himself unable to move. The whispers grew louder, more desperate, and he realized with a sinking feeling that they were coming from the figure itself. It stepped closer, its movements jerky and unnatural. Thomas tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure reached out a long, skeletal hand, and he felt a cold, numbing sensation spread through his body. He tried to fight it, but it was no use. The figure leaned in, its void-like face inches from his, and he felt himself being pulled into the emptiness within it. The next morning, the wind returned, howling through the trees as though mourning another loss. The townsfolk gathered in the square, their faces grim. They knew what had happened, though they would never speak of it. Thomas's lantern lay abandoned at the edge of the forest, its light extinguished. And deep within the woods, the Hollowing waited, patient and hungry, for the next time the wind would stop. The Hollowing was not a creature of flesh and blood, but a force, an ancient, insatiable hunger that had existed long before the town of Hollow's End. It fed on fear, on despair, on the very essence of those who ventured too close. And it was patient, biding its time until the wind stopped and the forest fell silent. The townsfolk knew better than to speak of it. They passed down warnings in hushed tones, their eyes darting nervously to the woods. But outsiders, drawn by the town's eerie beauty, rarely heeded their warnings. And so, the cycle continued, the Hollowing claiming its victims one by one. The wind howled through the trees, a mournful sound that echoed through the town. The forest stood silent and still, its secrets hidden in the shadows. And deep within its heart, the Hollowing waited, patient and hungry, for the next time the wind would stop.